Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tamara Gonzalez, and I'm a double major in feminist studies and anthropology. And the name of my project is In the Wake of Ethnic Studies, HB 2281, the Future of Ethnic Studies. This project focuses on the attitudes of Latino students here at UCSC towards ethnic studies in the wake of Arizona's House Bill 2281, which is the ethnic studies ban in K-12 education. My research question was, what are UCSC Latino students' attitudes about ethnic studies in the wake of HB 2281? I must admit that when I first started this project, I was interested in discussing the absence of ethnic studies here at UCSC, but what I found was that there were many more broader questions that I didn't expect. Some of the broader questions I will also be unpacking are, why should we not consider Arizona as exceptional? How has HB 2281 changed the rhetoric of ethnic studies elsewhere throughout the nation? And how has this backlash against ethnic studies been affected by the rhetoric of neoliberalism reflected through HB 2281? And how has this neoliberal sentiment highlighted the increase of privatization of the university? First, I want to start with a quote that has guided my research since the beginning before I unpack HB 2281. According to the United Nations, states should, when appropriate, take measures in the field of education to encourage the knowledge of the history, traditions, language, and culture of the minorities existing within the territory. As this quote conveys, the United Nations supports ethnic studies. And despite this clear position of the importance of educating minorities under their own terms, Arizona continues to undermine the sentiments of a global power by maintaining a ban on ethnic studies in K-12 education. HB 2281 is not only in violation of a UN declaration, as UN representatives have spoken out against it continuously, but HB 2281 has affected how ethnic studies has been addressed throughout this country. First, I want to look at HB 2281. Section 15-111 states, the legislature finds and declares that public school pupils should be taught to treat and value each other as individuals and not be taught to resent or hate other races or classes of people. Following this, 15-112 outlines any courses and curriculums that 1, promote the overthrow of the United States government, 2, promote resentment towards a race or class of people, or 3, are designed primarily for peoples of a particular ethnic group, or 4, advocate ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of peoples as individuals. Surprisingly, HB 2281 is only banning Mexican American studies or raza studies, and it's only being enforced in the Tucson Unified School District. At the same time, Indigenous studies and African American studies still remain unaffected, and they're still intact. This is interesting considering that because of the shift of defining ethnic studies as Mexican American studies or raza studies, Arizona has prompted that other states define ethnic studies for themselves. By leaving African American and Indigenous studies intact, we see that Arizona's law was only meant to target Mexican American studies, and that in itself is problematic. Given this, why does HB 2281 matter? Well, it reflects neoliberalist thinking. And for the purpose of this project, I am defining neoliberalism as a set of economic and political policies centered on the idea of free markets. And how this relates in an educational context is it means a decrease in state funding, which means a rise in tuition costs, prompting students to invest in their own educational efforts. And also, and neoliberalist ideas also create a dependency on procuring private funds from corporations and private donors. This means an increase of research partnerships with corporations, changing the dynamic of what knowledges are valid, valuable, and necessary. Given this, how does this affect universities and public education? For universities, neoliberalism is reflected in the low funding priority given to ethnic studies in the wake of HB 2281. UC Berkeley, University of Texas Austin, and the University of Pennsylvania have all reduced funding to their ethnic studies programs departments within the last year. HB 2281 has also impacted the rhetoric around ethnic studies. It has framed ethnic studies as divisive because it gives students the chance to take classes about their histories and cultures and others' histories and cultures. It has seen ethnic studies as ethnic chauvinistic because it grants students access to new identity formations in race and ethnic formations. It is seen as un-American because it allows students to learn about others' histories in relation to their own, rather than just one total American history. And it also is problematic because it emphasizes the individual instead of the collective. Students should not be taught that there are barriers to the American dream, or this is what HB 2281 is pushing for. The neoliberalism that exists within education today pushes that all students should assimilate to American ideals, but does not take into the account the histories of marginalization and oppression that have marginalized minority students in education. Without a historical political context, HB 2281 could be seen as an appropriate law. Yet HB 2281 specifically targets a specific ethnic studies program that was closing the opportunity gap for many minority students. So through this context, we're able to even further discuss the role of education and how through a shift in privatization and individualism, the question of who has the right to teach and what they can teach comes to play. How does this relate to our local context of UCSC? As we see here, this is a graphic that was taken from the UCSC catalog and states that although UCSC does not have a separate undergraduate program in ethnic studies at UCSC, students with an interest in ethnic studies can find an array of courses on the subject in several departments, including American Studies, Anthropology, Community Studies, Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies, and Feminist Studies, to name a few. Given this, 2 ethnic studies fields have been lost within the last 2 years under the guise of budget cuts: American Studies and Community Studies. At the same time, other majors were added in the same period: Cognitive Science, the first robotics engineering major in the US, and Jewish Studies, to name a few. Most of these new majors are privately funded, thus reflecting the push for departments and programs to procure private funding even here at UCSC. Despite this, students and faculty also continue a 40-year struggle for a critical race and ethnic studies department that would undoubtedly impact the lives of many students. UC Santa Cruz is the only longstanding UC that does not have an ethnic studies program or department. Considering the loss of 2 ethnic studies fields and associated faculty, UCSC stands to lose the continuity of this campus' foundational commitment to intellectual dialogue on the necessity and value of diversity. The proposed CREST program or department would only add to the existing ethnic fields, but also provide a crucial understanding to the intertwined nature of histories of inequality, discrimination, and racial violence, and social movements for justice, equality, and representation within local, national, and global contexts. Thus, considering how HB 2281 has affected the rhetoric of ethnic studies throughout the nation, and how students continue to demand a CREST department or program on this campus, it is imperative to discuss the impact of ethnic studies on students' educational trajectories in this historical moment when ethnic studies departments are under erasure and attack. In addition, we must also look how the absence of ethnic studies has affected students in higher education. Now I want to turn to my study and discuss Latino students' attitudes towards ethnic studies in the wake of HB 2281. First, I want to discuss Latino students and education.